The first thing FDR had to do was deal with the crisis. So he had to deal with the banking crisis. Remember, he declared a bank holiday. He had to just calm things down. And similarly, Biden has to deal with COVID. And then you get to the underlying problems. For Roosevelt, it was the fact that there wasn't a social safety net. He had to create one, which is still with us today, albeit a bit tattered. And Biden will then have to shift towards the underlying problems of systemic racism, of income inequality, and all of the things that are not going away easily.
So I want to welcome you all to the first of the second of a new type of series that Suffolk University is doing in collaboration with Ford Hall Forum and WGBH, which we're billing as a survey course for everyone. The topic of this semester-long survey course will be focusing on the Biden transition. Tonight's kickoff show is going to tee up what we'll do for the rest of the semester, which is examine what we know about inaugurations, what we think will be conventional or completely unconventional about this inauguration upcoming. And then we'll also have a talk with some congressional and presidential scholars about the issues that we want to be looking out for during the first 100 days of the Biden administration. And it's those issues which we will cull from a long list of things that the Biden administration needs to address and uncover and take a deeper dive into all of those issues throughout the course of the semester. So I want to turn things over now to Susan Spurlock, who is the director of the Ford Hall Forum. Susan?
Welcome, everyone. Good evening. And on behalf of the Forum, the Political Science and Legal Studies Department at Suffolk University, and our producing partner and co-sponsor, GBH Forum Network, I'd like to welcome you to this evening's virtual kickoff for our Spring 2021 lecture series number 46, examining the first 100 days of the Biden administration, a survey course for all. On day one, the Biden administration will inherit a formidable set of challenges: a raging global pandemic, an associated economic crisis, an ongoing reckoning with racial justice at home, a global climate crisis, complex international and national security challenges, and a crisis of democracy, all in the context of a deeply divided nation and world. This series will track developments in all of these areas with panels of experts, analysts, and practitioners. We invite you to take a seat in our virtual classroom and participate in this survey course for everyone. Joseph R. Biden Jr. will become the 46th President of the United States next Wednesday, January 20th. And nobody expects a conventional inauguration. In this evening's launch of our spring series, we'll talk with the guy who wrote the book on US inaugurations, Jim Bendat, about exactly how unconventional this will be, and some of his insights will surprise you. Next, we'll get into the weeds and assess President-elect Biden's ambitious promise to build back better in light of this contentious transition. Elaine Kamarck, a senior fellow at Brookings Institute, an expert on American electoral politics and government innovation and reform, and Julia Azari, an associate professor at Marquette University, whose research interests include the American presidency, political parties, and political rhetoric, will discuss the political priorities, challenges, and opportunities on the horizon. And now it is my pleasure to introduce this evening's moderator, the incomparable Joe Mathieu. Welcome, Joe.
Thank you, Susan. It's a great honor to be back with the Ford Hall Forum at Suffolk University as we look forward to next week's inauguration. The timing of this conversation is not lost on us. The US House has just impeached President Trump for a second time. And the broken glass and the broken bones from last week's attack on the US Capitol are still fresh in our memories. With continued security threats now that you've likely heard about against the Capitol, we're embarking on an inaugural, as Susan mentioned, unlike any other in our lives. And so we gather tonight to embrace this tradition, to try to learn from its history, and to look ahead to what we might expect in the first 100 days of a Biden administration, the many challenges we faced, as Susan outlined. Our first guest tonight is a true expert, Jim Bendat, aforementioned, inaugural historian and author of the great book, Democracy's Big Day, the inauguration of our president, 1789 to 2013. He's been to more inaugurals than we can count, and he's with us as part of this forum. Thanks for being here, Jim, and good evening.
Thank you, Joe. Good to be with you.
So what started as a hobby for you became the definitive book on presidential inaugurations. So you know how different this one will be, thanks to COVID, thanks to this very real security threat. At least we can expect a swearing in at high noon, though, right?
The swearing in at high noon and the inaugural address are going to be just about the only things that are going to be normal. Normally,
give us a sense of what is normal, Jim, and compare that to what this year looks like.
Sure. Normally, the first thing that we see on inauguration morning is the meeting of the old and the new. The incoming president comes to the White House and visits the outgoing president. He's invited in. They have coffee and pastries together. They schmooze for about a half hour. This is a 1993 photo of George Bush, 41, greeting Bill Clinton and their families, of course, at the White House on inauguration morning in 1993. And this is very typical. The outgoing president greets the new president, and right after that, they went into the White House. After that, then they get into a car together for a procession to the Capitol. So those are traditional events. They're very symbolic, and the world sees this, and often it's very amazing for people around the world to see such a thing, because it's not that way in other countries. And then after the ceremony itself, normally there would be an inaugural parade, and then an inaugural ball, or maybe even many inaugural balls at night. We're not going to see those things either.
So it's kind of it's almost easier to say, like we started, what will be consistent, because very few things will be. We've been spending this last week to the day, Jim, looking at horrifying images and preparing for Morning Edition. These past several shows has really been trying. Every day it's another very disturbing vision against the backdrop of this beautiful Capitol that so many of us love and have so many positive associations with. I grabbed a photograph, a couple of them from, I've not been to nearly as many inaugurals as you have, but I've been to a couple in my time covering the White House and Capitol Hill. And this image from Barack Obama's inauguration, it struck me to look at this view from the Capitol stands, from the scaffolding, because we've been seeing so many images of the attack, of the riot from that angle. And look at that crowd that went all the way to the Washington Monument and almost all the way to the Lincoln without interruption. You can see us there. I was anchoring for satellite radio at the time on the scaffolding on what was a frigid morning. We spent the night out there. But my goodness, just the absolute opposite, the contrast between the images that we have seen this past week, the destruction and the violence, compared to what was such a celebration that year, Jim, with so many people. It was an historic moment, obviously, the inauguration of America's first Black president. People came from all over the country, and they were walking on air, coming from Union Station to the National Mall. It is the exact opposite of the Capitol, the way it looks now, as Fortress America.
Well, there was a lot of security then, too. There's been security
That's true.
in every inauguration since 9/11, really. But this year it's going to be ridiculous. There probably will be a lot more National Guard members and other security forces than there will be people attending the inauguration. So that's going to be very different. There were close to 2 million people there in 2009. I wasn't as close as you were. I was way back in the middle of all that. But as you recall, it was a very freezing day, but it was very exciting. And people did go all the way back to the Lincoln Memorial.
That's right. We didn't have to fake that one. We had to spend the night out there because security was so intense, and the many threats that Barack Obama faced should not be. I certainly don't want to make light of that. But when we see an 8-foot unscalable fence and a couple of thousand National Guard troops, Army troops surrounding the Capitol, what an image! I know you're going to walk us through a couple of moments here in history to kind of help us understand what's going on now, Jim. Donald Trump says he's not going to attend. And of course, as you explained, that should be the beginning of this morning, the meeting of these two, outgoing and incoming president, the family, the meeting of the press and so forth. Without that, however, and I guess Mike Pence is going to be at the inaugural, what does it mean in terms of this transition of power? And you'll tell us this isn't the first time we had a couple guys didn't get along.
Well, it's not the first time, but first I would comment. Last week, on January the 6th, we had a physical assault on democracy. And I view Donald Trump's decision to not participate, to not invite the Bidens to the White House, to not even show up at the inauguration, that's a symbolic assault on democracy. Now, not everybody might feel that way. I know Trump supporters who feel he shouldn't go. I know Biden supporters who are happy that Trump is not going to be there. But I find it to be very sad. It's the first time since 1869. Andrew Johnson was the last president to not attend the inauguration of his successor. The first two were John Adams in 1801, then his son John Quincy Adams in 1825. Now, and this is here we see a 1913 picture demonstrating what a procession is like. Now, back then they rode in carriages, and later it changed to automobiles, of course. So here's William Howard Taft, the outgoing president in 1913, alongside Woodrow Wilson, the new president. And they're getting along just fine, a very happy occasion, a wonderful example of an orderly transition of power from one president to another and one party to another. 20 years later, in 1933, the outgoing and the incoming drove together in an automobile. That's Herbert Hoover and Franklin D. Roosevelt. But they didn't really communicate very well. There are a lot of pictures from that occasion. They had a bitter campaign. As you can see in the picture, Hoover's looking straight ahead. FDR is looking at the crowd. Other times he's actually, in other pictures, you can see FDR leaning toward Hoover as if to engage him in conversation, but they had a little bit of a contentious ride to the White House. Excuse me, from the White House to the Capitol.
Understood. Can't quite imagine what that conversation would have been like now. As we consider, Jim, what's going to happen in a week or 1 week out here, the speech is, of course, a huge part of this, and every incoming president has the same job there, but it's a different task for the moment, right? This is the opportunity to seize the moment. It won't be a first impression for Joe Biden, but when we consider the great inaugural speeches of all time, and the dark one, frankly, that Donald Trump began his administration with, what's the job for Joe Biden?
The job for Biden clearly is to try to do whatever he can to try to bring our country together. You can expect his speech to be one of unity, one of reconciliation. There's no doubt that he's going to try to do that. He's been talking about that all along the campaign trail, how he wanted to try to bring the country together. And he's been talking about it ever since the election. So it won't be a surprise. And that's very, very common. That's what you generally see. We in inaugural addresses, they're usually only about 15 minutes in length. But if you go way back to even the first change of power back in 1801, that would be when Thomas Jefferson took over from John Adams. That was the first real change of power in Washington, because after all, the first two presidents we had in our country, Washington and Adams, were both Federalists. And now here comes Jefferson representing a new party, the Democratic Republicans. And Jefferson saw his task as wanting to bring the country together. He said in his inaugural address, "We are all Republicans, we are all Federalists." And that really set the tone for future inaugurations.
Well, let's think back to some of these moments, Jim, because you've made the point that the best inaugural addresses come from the most tense situations, and we're certainly in one now.
Well, that's been the case often. Look at the Civil War inaugurations of Abraham Lincoln. What could be more of a tense time than a Civil War? And so Abraham Lincoln was sworn in 1861, just as the Civil War was about to begin. And then his second inauguration in 1865 was just as the Civil War was about to end. In his first inaugural address, he tried to bring the country together and hoped that the Civil War wouldn't take place. His speech didn't work, but he made the effort. And then in 1865, when it was clear the war was winding down, he said, "With malice toward none and with charity for all, we're going to move on and we're going to get back together."
You think we have quotes for the ages that come out of this speech next week?
I don't know about that. Most inaugural addresses do not provide great quotes that live on. But there have been a few inaugurations where that has occurred. Franklin D. Roosevelt in 1933 would be another one with a memorable inaugural address. That was when we were in the middle of the Great Depression, and he tried to soothe everybody's fears when he said, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself." And then I think the greatest inaugural address of all time would be John F. Kennedy's. Everybody should go on YouTube if you've never seen it. It's only about 15 minutes again. So many great phrases, so many memorable quotes in his inaugural address. And the most famous of them would be, "Ask not what your country can do for you, ask what you can do for your country."
Might be worth asking again. Before you leave us, Jim, I'd love to ask you one question that's come up from a couple of folks in our audience, and one that I plan to ask you about myself. It was actually considered, as I remember, in 2009 because it was so cold. And that was the possibility of holding this indoors. I mean, that would be kind of the ultimate way of managing our security issue, at least. Maybe not so much COVID, but it's happened before and not that long ago.
True. The picture we're looking at now is Ronald Reagan's second inauguration in 1985. That was one of those very cold days, wind chill factor close to zero. So it was so cold that they decided to move the ceremony indoors. And there he is inside the Capitol Rotunda, taking the oath of office from the Chief Justice. That was the third time that cold weather had forced the inauguration to be indoors. The other ones were 1833 for Andrew Jackson's second inauguration, and also 1909 with William Howard Taft. Now, in terms of this year, they're still planning to have it outdoors. More social distancing outdoors, I guess.
Okay.
Never know about, look how you saw the picture of Reagan there. There wasn't much social distancing there. So they've got a lot of issues to consider this year.
That's for sure. Not a drive-in inaugural, kind of like we saw in the campaign. But yeah, there's a lot to consider here. How would you compare, lastly, while you're with us here, the sort of stages that come after the inaugural? Is there going to be a parade like usual? Will there be reviewing stands at the White House? And what about the letter, Jim?
Well, here's an example of a letter. This one from 1993. By tradition, the outgoing president writes a letter to the new president, which the new president then finds inside the Resolute desk inside the Oval Office when the new president comes back to the White House. And generally, you'll see the outgoing president wishing the new president well. We don't know for sure whether Trump is going to write a letter for Biden. Barack Obama did write one for Trump. So it's been going on for quite some time.
He's indicated reportedly that the president is considering writing a letter, doesn't know if he will. The rest of it will not happen, though. And I wonder what that first day is going to be like for Joe Biden, just kind of walking into the White House all by himself.
Well, yeah, and you asked about the inaugural parade, that kind of a thing. They actually had put up a reviewing stand in front of the White House. That's where the new president usually reviews the parade participants, the marching bands and so on. But then they tore it down. So we know there's no traditional parade this year. There's going to be some kind of a military escort for Biden, but that's really about it. There's going to be no luncheon in the Capitol, which usually takes place right after the ceremony. So most of the traditions are going by the wayside this year.
Apparently there will be a wreath laying with former presidents Clinton and Bush that will, I guess, make some attempt at unity with at least a couple of former presidents from two different parties, Jim. This is unlike anything we've ever seen. And I want to thank you for spending some time with us here. I think we all learned a lot.
Sure. Good to talk with you, Joe.
Jim Bendat is inaugural historian, and the book, again, is Democracy's Big Day, the inauguration of our president, 1789 to 2013. Thank you again, Jim, for helping us through this. We've compiled a not comprehensive list of hopes for action from the Biden administration in the first 100 days of his presidency, and that's where we're looking next year. You'll see it right on your screen. What's on your 100 days wish list? I told you it's not comprehensive. So click away. It's multiple choice, and we'll have some results for you a little bit later on. As we examine the first 100 days of the Biden administration, we're joined by Julia Azari, PhD and Director of Graduate Studies for the Political Science and International Affairs program at Marquette University. Also joining us this evening, as Susan mentioned at the top of the program, Elaine Kamarck, PhD, Senior Fellow and Director of the Center for Effective Public Management at the Brookings Institute, served in the Clinton administration, has been a longtime member of the Democratic National Committee, and is also a lecturer at Harvard's Kennedy School. Elaine and Julia, thank you so much both for being here this evening and joining us in the forum.
Yeah, thank you for the invitation.
By all means. I'd like to walk through a couple of the cabinet selections and other hires with each of you and see what we can learn here in our time. So why not start with the biggest issue facing this country? I think we can all agree right now is the virus, even with what we've seen over the last week. Vaccinating the nation may be the top priority now, right? And the biggest challenge at the same time of the first 100 days. Joe Biden has pledged 100 million doses in the first 100 days, which makes a great slogan. He's asked Dr. Fauci to stay on. He's hired Jeff Zients to coordinate the response. He's nominated California's Attorney General to run the Department of Health and Human Services. I'd love for you both to take a swing at this. Julia, is this setup working for you? And what's that going to mean for inoculating the nation in the first term, or certainly the first year, I guess, of Joe Biden's first term?
Yeah, so I mean, I think that this is really, at least for someone like me who's a kind of a conventional presidency scholar, not a public health scholar, feels really like uncharted territory. And, you know, like this is such a major coordination effort. And so far the vaccine rollout feels to me, and I think a lot of other people, like it's been so shaky that I'm hesitant to make a strong prediction. But clearly, you know, this team is a team that reflects Biden's priority of experience, that reflects his priority of diversity and understanding a lot of different communities. I think it's interesting, as we point out, the California origins of the new Health and Human Services Director, Becerra. So, you know, that's obviously been a state that's really been hit hard by COVID, and so it's possible geography will matter there. But I'm really honestly kind of waiting and seeing, because this is such a massive coordination and federalism and public health task. I don't really know. I have some comparisons for some of the other agenda items, but I don't really know entirely what to compare it to. But certainly whatever benchmarks I could think of, it basically meets those.
Elaine, you created the Clinton administration's National Performance Review. And I know you have a unique understanding of what resources the White House has. Of course, as Julia mentioned, we've got this interesting and very complex scenario working with states and corporations all at the same time to deliver vaccines. But is Joe Biden making the right moves here that I described so far in building out his health team?
Yes, I think so. Look, one of the advantages we have is that Joe Biden is the most experienced president we've had in a long time. In fact, I think you have to go back quite a ways to find somebody with the depth of experience that Biden brings to office. So if anybody can weave together the complex agencies in the federal government and the states, it's going to be Biden. I think he'll be able to do that if it can be even done. There's another issue here that I'd like to bring up, which is that the impeachment, which was voted on today, creates a problem because of the Senate. The Constitution says that the Senate has to put aside all business when the articles of impeachment are brought over to the Senate. Well, this could mean that instead of Biden being able to pass a new COVID relief bill, the Senate will have to be obsessed with this trial. And this is causing great consternation, I know, within the Biden camp and among others. So Biden has asked the Senate parliamentarian to sort of figure out if they can do two things at once. And of course, we want COVID relief money because with Democrats in control of the Senate, you're going to be able to get state and local aid. And state and local aid was the one thing the Republicans were not going to vote for in the prior bill. And we really need that to make this federalism work in the vaccination business.
Well, that understood, and the stimulus is a major factor. I'll ask you both about the economy in a moment. But Elaine, how about just basic confirmations? I mean, the Senate has to help him build the staff before he can do anything.
Well,
Would that build up as well?
Yes and no. I mean, yes and no. I mean, in reinventing government, we did an awful lot of business before we had all the confirmations done. So the departments are still operating. You can do a lot of things without a confirmed team in place. But I think clearly the Senate is good because there's Democratic control now, will move, I think, fairly quickly on confirmations. The confounding factor, you can do confirmations and a Senate and a COVID relief bill. You can do confirmations and a civil rights bill. What the question is now is, can you do those things with a trial going on? And that is something that is, as Julia said before, it's one other thing that we're in uncharted territory about.
I know it's common for politicians, frequently governors and others. We're going to see a mayor here become potentially a secretary, cabinet secretary. Are you both fine, Julia, with the idea of essentially a political operative here, a politician getting this job to run HHS as opposed to somebody with a medical background or at least a shared background in those areas? In terms of Javier Becerra.
Yeah, I mean, that's pretty standard.
It is, but
I
this
think
is
that
extraordinary times. It's just come up a few times, which is why I ask you both.
Sure, right. And this was an issue with, I'm sure we'll talk about Ron Klain at some point, right? When he was appointed in the Obama administration to coordinate the Ebola virus, I remember the same kinds of objections, right? That this is a person with a political background and management background and not a medical background. I mean, I think that it's important. I could probably take the whole hour saying cranky things about the sort of emergent Twitter discourse about Biden's cabinet appointments. I will try to control myself, but I think that, it's important that people are looking for certain things symbolically out of Biden's team. And I think that those signals really tell us a lot about what people in the broader electorate are looking for out of this administration. But it's not like the Secretary of Health and Human Services, or any other cabinet branch is going to operate on their own, right? They're going to manage. They're going to advocate for the needs of their department within the administration. Those are the things that they are going to do, and they're going to be the face, right? Which means that it is important that certain symbolic things are lined up in terms of what they stand for, their background, their character. But they're going to hire people with substantive expertise to sort of do the day to day, and that I think that's fine. And really, what I look for in cabinet members, and this is hard to predict, is how well they will advocate for the mission of their department in the sort of larger push and pull of the administration. And I don't have any strong signals either way about most of these nominees, but ultimately that's how I'll judge them.
Well, the virus is a public health crisis. It is also an economic one. As you started leading us toward here, Elaine, Joe Biden has picked Janet Yellen to run Treasury. Very popular. Boy, to think that he threaded the needle like that to make Wall Street and Elizabeth Warren happy in one announcement is still amazing to me. Mayor Walsh to run Labor Department, and he has a Democratic-run Congress to pass another stimulus. Does this give you hope for an economic recovery in the second half of the year and in the first year of Joe Biden's first term?
Oh, absolutely. Look, I mean, I've been saying for a while now that Joe Biden has one job. That is to get these vaccinations into Americans as quickly as he can. Because once that happens, we can really open up. Now, he's got a great big economic agenda, build back better and all that stuff, which is great. But the fact of the matter is, simply ending the pandemic will lead to a huge amount of pent-up demand and an economic boom. Think of all the birthdays delayed, the trips delayed, the purchases delayed. Think of all the things that have been, repressed by this pandemic. That's number one. And to your previous question, let me just point out that it's not the Secretary of HHS that has to be a person with a public health background, because that person needs more political skills. The ones to watch for is who heads the Food and Drug Administration and who heads the CDC, Center for Disease Control, in the Biden administration. Those posts, as with many other posts throughout the government, do require technical expertise, but not necessarily the cabinet secretaries, who spend an awful lot of time dealing with Congress and dealing with the press.
That's right. Julia, if you want to take a swing at all things economic, we could go in a lot of directions here. There are tens of millions of people unemployed. There are businesses that are being shut down still that may not reopen. We've certainly seen that in the services sector here in Boston, hospitality. A lot of jobs that may or may not come back. That's kind of hard to gauge right now. Interest rates are near zero. You've got a stock market at an all-time high as the backdrop to this chaos. And there are reasons for that. But when you consider the need for a stimulus, is that the first job from an economic standpoint?
I mean, that seems like, I don't know if it's the first job. It seems like the tool that they have, right? This is the hammer. I guess I think that there's good possibility for an effective stimulus. I think that there's good possibility, as Elaine says, for things to open back up and for many of the problems to go away. And hopefully that will be a resurgence in some of the sectors that have been hit so hard. I have a lot of friends who work in theater, and that's just been impossible. Obviously, the sector I work in, higher education, has struggled. But it also seems to me that there are these other structural problems in the economy that were present. They were present for the 2008 crisis. They were present throughout the various years of recovery, massive inequality. And we're hearing a lot about questions about student loans. Some of these questions may not be directly linked to the immediate relief, but this is where I can't help sort of think about the structure of the New Deal. And I don't think this is gonna be a New Deal presidency, but you did have this kind of structure of immediate relief, stop the bleeding. And then you had this sort of moment of, okay, how do we really think about how our economy works, what the underlying causes were of this problem? And it seems to me that there is some demand for that. And will that be the political priority? Will impeachment which also deals with a host of important issues. Will that sort of take over that early agenda? What will it look like? I don't know, but I think that's going to be harder to ignore than it was early in Obama's first term.
Joe Biden made headlines with his choice of Merrick Garland, certainly to be the next Attorney General. Some say the Department of Justice, Elaine, has been seriously mismanaged, if not undermined, over the past 4 years. The FBI has been routinely disrespected by President Trump. And you could argue it is in disarray. Bill Barr didn't even make it to the end here. How do you begin reversing that?
Well, I think there'll be a huge new team at the Department of Justice, beginning obviously with Merrick Garland. The place I suspect Joe Biden will start with is with the Office of Civil Rights, the Civil Rights Division. That has suffered the most degradation under the Trump presidency. So I suspect he'll find a very strong person to be the Assistant AG for Civil Rights, and that will go to a lot of the underlying problems. I liked the way Julia set this up in terms of the FDR comparison, because if you go back to 1933, the first thing FDR had to do was deal with the crisis. So he had to deal with the banking crisis. And remember, he declared a bank holiday. He had to just calm things down. And similarly, Biden has to deal with COVID. And then you get to the underlying problems. For Roosevelt, it was the fact that there wasn't a social safety net. He had to create one, which is still with us today, albeit a bit tattered. And Biden will then have to shift towards the underlying problems of systemic racism, of income inequality, and all of the things that are not going away easily. And I think that if you look at it in that sort of 1-2 way, as Julia introduced, I think that's exactly the way Biden will be forced to operate.
I appreciate that answer. Before we bring in our students, we have, as mentioned, some students from Suffolk who are going to be joining us and probably posing the smarter questions of the evening here. But I do want to ask you about something because we're hearing so much about it right now. We just impeached the president today in the US House, and we've been hearing many calls for unity. Since the election was called from Joe Biden and from Republicans over the past 48 hours, there's an incredible opportunity here for Joe Biden, Julia. But if 40% of the country and 80% of Republicans think the election was stolen, how?
How? Is that the question?
But is it? Is it possible, I guess, is the question.
Sorry, the audio dropped for a second. Is it possible for him to get things passed? I mean, here, I guess
even from a more abstract perspective here, it's not feeling like we're there, certainly at the moment.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is. I think maybe we keep going back to the FDR example. Even there, about 40% of the electorate, a little less, voted for Herbert Hoover. Obviously, you didn't see the same kind of damage to democracy that we've seen over the past week and over the past couple months, right? That's not an equivalence, but I do think that. I return to that example because people think of that as such a pivotal and critical moment in which the tide of public opinion turned and the politics shifted, but not completely, right? And the kinds of criticisms that he faced were quite deep and quite harsh. And I think that's true at any point in history when you look at a president who we now think of as unifying. So I think unity is a really elusive goal. And I guess I'll say two things about that. One is that, my first book, I guess to date, my only book, is on presidential mandates. And what I found is that it's not, the way we think of it and talk about the election isn't entirely shaped by the actual facts of the election. But an election that is contested and is seen as illegitimate does kind of bring a presidency down. And Biden is in this very strange situation in which there's really no hard evidence that there's anything wrong with the 2020 election. And by all expert accounts I've heard, it's one of our better run elections. But there is this widespread sense of illegitimacy. So we'll kind of have to see about, who continues to spread that message, and if anyone will, once President Trump is out of office. There's obviously lots of contenders of people who might do that, but we'll see how long that message lasts. But it is, that is a concern. I guess the other question is, if unity is elusive, what you're sort of left with is kind of raw power politics, and Biden will have a very narrowly controlled but unified government, and that can be an opportunity to, I think, probably get a lot done. Will it be unifying? No, but it will potentially be, what he ultimately decides he was elected to do.
Elaine Cameron got to it slightly differently, and one of our audience members asking, if Biden is a centrist, how will he manage far left Democrats and far right Republicans? But as a real Beltway insider, are we being too cute with the unity talk, or are you hopeful?
No, I'm hopeful for the following reason. There is some indication here that the Republican Party is splintering, and they are splintering into, finally, a lot of people will say it's too late, into people who are willing to take on Trump and Trumpism. And we're going to know a lot in the next few weeks, because if Mitch McConnell actually votes to convict Donald Trump in a Senate trial, that's going to be a huge sign that something is really changing. The Republican Party in the Trump era has been complicit, not challenging him openly on his lies, not sort of taking him on, that they've done once in a while. They did it on the Russian sanctions bill. They did it on a few, they overrode his veto of the NDAA most recently. But basically, they've been really complicit. And now it looks like you've got a big rift in the Republican Party led by Congresswoman Cheney from Wyoming. And I think that this will diminish that piece of the party and make for some interesting bipartisan possibilities. And we didn't have that before.
That sounds hopeful to me.
A little bit.
Julia, thank you. Stay where you are. We're going to have our student questioners join us, and we'll bring Jim back in a minute. You might have remembered the poll that we asked you to weigh in on about a half hour ago or so. How about some results here? Remember, I asked you, based on the wishes of our guests, our producers, our not comprehensive list of hopes for action from the Biden administration. And we have a clear winner. The coronavirus task force, far out there with 81%. What came in second here as I'm scrolling? It looks like the economy at 50%, and then climate change and the environment at 40%, which is pretty fascinating.
Justice.
Say it one more time.
Racial justice also.
Yeah, where do I see it? Is it still?
You got to scroll down.
Yeah, I'm
sorry. And rebuilding trust in government. Those are about tied.
Yeah.
Something. We've got a lot of people in here too taking this poll, so that's pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
All right. So with that said, with everything that we've just discussed, I'm really looking forward to hearing from our students. Again, they're from Suffolk University, and they're coming from a couple of different walks of learning, a couple of different academic disciplines, but have been really focused on this this week and what's happening in Washington this election. And I want to thank all of you for being here, for turning your cameras on, and for getting involved. So I believe we're going to start with Rebecca Zlotowicz, who's an actual poli-sci major. You're right in the pocket here, Rebecca. What's your question?
So my question is for Ms. Kamarck, and I'm wondering, will Donald Trump's record of consorting with anti-democratic nations pose a challenge for the incoming Biden administration as they try to restore America's international standing?
Two ways to answer that. Thank you, Rebecca. First of all, I think Biden will have to spend a lot of time, as will his Secretary of State, literally reversing 180 degrees what Donald Trump was doing, particularly with anti-democratic nations. And I think the message will be clear to North Korea. I think the message will be clear to the Saudis. I worry more about the lack of trust that our allies around the world and people who look up to us now have in the United States after the Trump era. There are simply nations who never imagined that America would do the things that we've done, gone back on our agreements, everything from pulling that precipitous pulling of troops out of Syria, and all the things that Trump has done, which have been way out of line with, the basic mainstream in foreign policy. So I think his more difficult job will be regaining the trust of our allies. And that, I think, Trump has really seriously eroded.
Thank you, Elaine. Thank you, Rebecca. We could have done a whole show on reforming our image abroad, and maybe we will. Dina Singh is a law student at Suffolk and joins us. Dina, what's your question?
Hello, my question is for Dr. Julia Azari about our country's response to the pandemic. We know that Biden has a goal to have 100 million people vaccinated by the end of his 100 days. Do you think that this goal is attainable or too ambitious? And what other measures do you think he'll take to curb the spread of COVID-19 that Trump didn't?
I think so. This is a really tricky question because of the federalism that we talked about at the beginning of the hour. I mean, it's an excellent question. We have a tricky system. I think that, I don't have a strong opinion about the kind of practical implications of how many millions of shots might be possible, but I think it's really important for him to come in with an ambitious plan. I think this is another thing that's really lacking in the Trump years, is this sort of sense of what government and what the United States can do. And I think that sense, particularly at this point in the pandemic, is really flagging. And so I think it's critically important for Biden to come in with an ambitious plan to actually solve the problem, whether or not that's feasible. There's a couple things that have to be overcome in order to achieve that goal. As a couple of the things we talked about in the beginning of the program. So dealing with this through the states, working with different states. I anticipate that, as with many other policy areas, this will be easier with some states than others. Some states have a little bit more public health infrastructure than others. Will be more receptive to that call. The other is production, right? Working with companies to deal with production. I think this is an area where Biden's expertise in government and his experienced team and people who are kind of devoted to the mission of what government can do will be very helpful in working with the private sector on production. And then there's kind of trust and messaging. And that, I think, I'm not sure what to think, right? Because the Biden administration, to me, seems so in line with this sort of middle of the road, as someone had mentioned before, kinds of messaging, but the information environment is just so intense and so flooded with misinformation. So I think that may actually end up being a kind of critical challenge that is a lot different than what past administrations have faced in public health crises. So I give it sort of a cautiously hopeful.
Thanks for your answer, Julia. Thanks for your great question, Dina. Thanks for being involved here. I want to encourage, by the way, everybody, student or otherwise, to submit a question in the Q&A box here on Zoom. If you're not familiar with that, just look straight down, click Q&A, and you can ask a question in here because our panelists will be available for a little bit longer. And I want to bring in Alejandro, another Suffolk student. Alejandro Mendoza Garcia is a film and cinematography student. So I'm really curious, Alejandro, to hear what your question is, because you're coming from a similar world that I studied in, and I'm guessing it brings an interesting perspective. Thanks for being here.
Thank you. I certainly hope it does. My question is for Jim Bendat. As we've discussed, you have attended the inauguration of 3 previous presidents, as well as having written extensively on that subject. Given the events of the 6th, what do you think will be the implications of Donald Trump's absence at the inauguration, of Biden on the current political climate? Will it be positive or negative?
Again, I sort of answered that question earlier. I think that so many of the supporters of Trump are going to be happy he's not there. And I think a lot of Biden supporters are happy that he won't be there. They might feel that it's going to be a more peaceful event because he's not there. On the other hand, there's always the possibility, as one of the students mentioned in the comments section, that it could be a dog whistle to his supporters to try to show up and be more violent, knowing that they couldn't harm him. Now, that is a fear. A lot of people are considering that possibility, but there's going to be so much security that I don't really think that's going to be a big factor. Basically, the ultimate answer to your question is, I think it's going to be an aberration. Donald Trump's entire presidency has been an aberration, and his not showing up, his being the first president in 152 years to not show up, that's another aberration.
Thank you, Alejandro. Nicely done. Maybe you'll make a documentary out of this someday. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you, Dina. Thanks for being part of the discussion and caring enough to be involved. What a great time to be a law student. What a great time to be studying politics. What a great time to be making films. So we have a couple of minutes left here, and I'd be curious, before I just ask a final question to all of our panelists and give you a sense to weigh in with some final thoughts. Elaine, just to key off of what Jim just said, the aberration of the Trump administration, what does this also mean? Let's say Donald Trump fades off into the sunset next week. What does this mean for the Republican members of Congress who mortgaged their careers to support this president over the last couple of weeks?
Well, that we are all anxious to learn. Okay, first of all, what happens to the whole Republican Party, and I think it's going to fall into two categories, right? There are going to be people from places like Mississippi, like the Dakotas, that are just staunch red states where lots and lots of Trump supporters, where they've resisted even, calls to wear masks. There's such Trump supporters. So there's going to be geographies like that where, frankly, not much is going to change. And then I think I think in the majority of the country, Republicans are going to have to figure out, how do they keep this Trump base kind of with them and expand the base. Trump is unique, an aberration, as Jim said. He's an aberration in so many ways, but one of the ways is that he never in 4 years attempted to expand his base. He only concentrated on talking to his base and sort of pleasing his base. And frankly, that's not a sustainable strategy for most of the Republicans in the country. It is in certain places, but it's not for most of the country. And I think these Republicans are going to have to figure out a way to live in a post-Trump world.
Well, thank you, Elaine. Let's open it up then. I'd love to hear from all three of you. Maybe your hopes for the future, and I guess I'll ask you by way of how people can get involved. We just heard from 3 young people who are obviously feeling the significance of this moment. So, young or old, most Americans probably are not piling into a van to go celebrate the inaugural the way they may have 4 or 8 or more years ago. Jim, let's start with you, Jim. How should people get involved to mend the rift? Is it about talking to your neighbors? Is it about getting involved in politics?
Well, communication is certainly important, and I'm thinking about the answer to an earlier question that you raised about what are important things for Biden to do in the early part of his administration. And all of those other answers were good, but a couple of other things come to my mind. One is the importance of restoring the meaning and the importance of truth. Truth in our dialogue, truth in our politics. Just stop the lying already. I don't know. I mean, Trumpism is going to continue for a while, but Biden has his work cut out for him. But truth is so important. And going along with that, it's very important that Biden do everything he can to restore American prestige and honor abroad. Many of us have made trips abroad while Trump has been president, and I'm sure a lot of us have had the occasion to speak to someone in a different country who've asked us, what in the world is happening in America? What is this? It's not the America that anybody recognized. So we've got to break away from that. We are the ones, along with Biden, we're the ones who need to make America great again.
Well put, Jim. You'll answer this however you like, of course, Julia, but it strikes me that education is a big part of this. I've been listening to people who clearly never knew how our elections worked, who don't know actually what our institutions do, which makes it very easy to accept lies about them.
I think that's right. I do think that education is a big part of it, but I do want to sort of answer the bigger question about how to get involved. And I think learning is really important, but I think that can happen in a lot of different contexts.
Yeah.
There's kind of a thing that people say about exercise, which is the best workout is the one you'll do. And I think that's the same thing with getting involved in whatever you think will make democracy better. So if you're not really into politics, then maybe your role is elsewhere. You know, maybe it's helping out in your local food bank or something like that. Maybe, you know, if you have always wanted to try getting involved in politics, now is the time. I want to recommend a book that is by actually an author who'll be local to those of you in the Boston area, Eitan Hirsch, who's a professor at Tufts University, and he wrote a book called Politics is for Power. And I don't agree with everything that he says, but he kind of makes the argument that we spend too much time in national politics and not enough, and that we're hobbyists, that we're just sort of watching, or not enough time in local politics really trying to make a difference. I think it's interesting. I think you know, if people are thinking about along those lines, it's probably an interesting and provocative read for you. My personal take on this is the thing that we most need to do is to remember that democracy is a collective activity, and that it's not just about having your voice be heard or, you know, being part of the process as an individual, but thinking about all the other people that we have to be in this together with and how they might share some of your values, but not all. And that's going to have to be okay. This is something, you know, we have to think about. How do we do this in this big, complicated, and diverse country?
Thanks, Julia. Elaine, I was lucky enough to live and work in Washington for almost 15 years. And you realize when you're when you're in the bubble, I guess, you just look at things differently, right? You've been working with Republicans for your entire career while you are obviously a prominent Democrat. Sometimes I wonder, the further you get away from the Beltway, the harder that is for people to understand. The lines are drawn, people turn into foreign entities. For you, it's work.
Yeah. I mean, you know, I know a lot of Republicans. I count them as my friends. I can tell you that there were many Republicans who've been appalled by this president, but have felt hopeless and helpless to do anything. I think that there are some Republican senators who, you know, will probably go forward and do the right thing if there is a trial in the Senate. I just wrote a piece this afternoon before I got on with you, sort of pointing the way to how we could find 17 Republican senators to vote for conviction. The thing about Washington is that you have to understand the other side. You have to talk to the other side because that's how you do business. And it does take some of the ability to demonize them away. Just one little anecdote. When I was teaching at Harvard one year, I brought one of the leading anti-tax advocates in Washington, D.C. to speak to my class. And my class, being many, many Democrats, was absolutely horrified. Absolutely horrified when I told them who I was bringing in. And yet, you know, my purpose was, hey, you got to learn what the other side says and understand where they're coming from, either to beat them, right? or to find some common ground. I mean, for whatever your end goal is, you've got to talk to the other side. And I think that many of the people outside of Washington are just happy to live in their bubble, and they never do really get to talk to the other side.
Boy, we got to figure out a way to turn the flame down. I think we can agree. By the way, our producers put a link to the book, Politics is for Power, that Julia mentioned, in the chat here, if you didn't notice that in the Q&A portion. Well, I want to thank you guys for spending some time with us and for a real smart conversation. We really need this right now. And so Elaine, thank you. Julia, thank you. Jim, thank you for being part of this Ford Hall Forum on the first 100 days. Thanks as well to Susan Spurlock, who started us off tonight in the Ford Hall Forum, Rachel Cobb and Christina Coolidge from Suffolk University's Political Science Department, and our great producers from GBH's Forum Network, who have just turned this whole thing into what I think should be forever on Zoom. Annie Schreffler, Lauren Joe Alejandro, GBH's Forum Network, thanks for all of your great work. This is the beginning of a series that will keep looking closely at Joe Biden's first 100 days. And you can find a link in the chat to sign up for the rest of these, what we're calling a survey course for everyone. Again, that's right in the chat. Thanks again for a smart talk and all of the insights from our panelists and from our audience members, our students, and their great questions. We know what you're feeling, and let's hope for some better days in the weeks ahead. Thank you again for joining us. I'm Joe Mathieu from GBH News.